Hey there.
Hey, Kyle.
Anybody there?
Can
Yeah,
can you hear me?
Laura's here with no video again. Hi, Connor.
Hello.
Hey, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Can you
Waiting for a
folks
couple
hear
more.
me?
Yes. Hi, Bill.
So Laura was having problems with her computer, so I started the meeting
Thank you.
and I'm going to sign off, but I won't shut the meeting down and I'll wait. Here's Joe Bullock
Okay.
and I don't see Laura, but I just told her she should be able to sign in now.
Well, there's another town of Woodstock there, but she should sign in. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just got in. Thank you. Thanks, Bill, so much. Yeah, I rebooted. Things were not working, oddly, but I rebooted and all of a sudden here we are. So thanks, Bill, for getting people on. And we still have Joe, I see. Joe said let him know when we're in. Joe, are you hearing us?
I am hearing you.
Yay. So we have a full ZRC. We have Kai Lord Farmer, and thank you, Kai. Sorry for the I was having issues with my laptop, but
No
rebooting
problem.
magically solved the problem. So sorry for the delay. So Bill, I'm going to reclaim host, and you can stay or go. Kai is going to give us an update on his thoughts are from the county on STRs and housing and anything else he wants to share with us. So you're welcome to stay or go, but thanks for getting us going.
I'm out and have a good meeting.
Okay, thanks for getting everybody going.
Yep, bye-bye.
Okay, and I'm going to see if my video works. Of course, I thought it wasn't going to because it hasn't. No, I'm still showing up like the town of Woodstock. We'll just leave it at that. I seem to be. I thought rebooting might fix my video, but apparently not. I guess I have to figure that out. But that's not why we're all here. So Kai, you have the floor. I know I did send Kai the raw data for the STR survey, and I sent Kai the file that had my my summary of the questions that people had multiple choice answers. So the summary of the answers responding, and then our other topic for this meeting, which I have to go find again because I had to reboot and lost it, is the planning board response to our to the scenic overlay. So after we talk with Kai, we'll want to go into that, take a look at their response, and then figure out what our responses are to their responses, because we certainly want to get that moving. So all that being said, Kai, thank you tremendously for being here. And we'll turn the meeting over to you.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, I'm happy to share my thoughts. I don't think they've changed too much, but I was trying to catch myself up. It's been a long time since I think I've visited with you as a body.
Yes.
So yeah, thanks for sending over the survey. I think in terms of general overall like recommendations or strategies, we're still kind of in line with the Housing Smart Communities general guidelines, which is kind of like two directions. Non-owner occupied, putting a cap on the number of those units that are permitted to around 1 or 2%, or just a general cap. So that's kind of the outline. I can go into more details there, but I think you all understand at this point what I'm talking about between those two avenues. But yeah, generally a cap, and then I think the question here, which the town of Woodstock has, and then the question is really about approach to owner occupied, non-owner occupied, and what that exactly means, and what the differences and restrictions are.
So let me
Is that right?
Let me just catch up. So
Sure.
non-owner occupied, the general thought is cap it to 1 to 2%, or a general cap, but it's 1%, 1 to 2% of housing units, dwelling units. 1 to 2% of what?
We recommend occupied housing units. because that takes out those seasonal rentals as well. It's a little harder to get data on that year to year, but there's ACS American Community Survey on like generally total housing units versus occupied housing units per year. So I think we generally say go off of that, but yeah,
And how do we get that?
I'm happy to send you a link to that. It's kind of,
Excellent.
yeah, it's probably the most consistent source of data that you could
Mhm.
use year to year. And there's,
Okay.
3-year and 5-year estimates, but
So if we were to look at, as you send us a link, if we were to look at the American Community Survey and see what
yeah,
our number of occupied housing units is, then we could go from that to figure out what 1 to 2% is and figure
right,
out what our cap ought to be of the non-owner occupied.
right, yeah. Yep,
Okay.
yep,
Now, owner occupied, and you and I spoke briefly on the phone earlier, just to bring people up to speed, because I don't think you said it on this call, but owner occupied, the trend you're finding, what you said earlier today to me, was the trend you're finding is people are not capping that, but the trick is to have good definitions of owner occupied so that we want to make sure we know, do we go with a definition of primary residence? Do we go with a definition of the owner is always there when the tenants are there or the
right.
guests are there? So getting the right definition might be tricky for owner occupied.
Yes, yeah, you got to define it in the law and how you're gonna. I think it makes sense to put it in the application itself.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the two that I was kind of referring to earlier today are City of Kingston, that just has a general cap of 1%, and on non-owner occupied, and then no cap on owner occupied, I believe. And then Town of Olive was the other one I referred to,
Mhm.
just in terms of how they're defining similar situation, no cap on owner occupied, but how they're defining owner occupied. And I pulled it up just a little bit earlier, so I can give me 1 second. I can share links to this as well, but I'm sure some of you know Supervisor Safranco, but Olive has been doing a pretty good job at putting the regulations in place, and then having the cap in place and verifying all the pieces of the application somewhat efficiently. I don't know, how much time it takes, but okay, so their definition: part-time occupant of the resident that resides on the premises less than 184 days of the year. So that's kind of half the year is how they're defining owner occupied. And then the proofs of residency are submitted federal tax form, and then the second form is like a choice of driver's license, pay stub. We have a Ulster County residency certificate that some people do have, voter registration card, bank statement with mailing address on it. So one of those, not all of those. Anyway, that's just one. It's pretty thorough.
Yeah, okay.
Um,
Now let me
but
go back before we go forward though. So owner
Yep.
occupied resides in the residence. I heard you say less than 180 days. What did you mean more
Sorry,
than?
the way that it was written was a part-time resident is less than, so
Oh,
a full-time residency.
so owner occupied would be more than part-time
Yeah,
resident is.
and it's kind of tied back to
Ah,
taxes. If you think about that, where you're filing taxes, where you spend the majority of the year.
80 days.
That's
Okay. So where do you, and this was Olive, you're saying, had the federal tax form and as one thing,
yeah,
but so
yeah.
if people come in with their federal tax form, I'm kind of tripping over. I mean, I've already
Well,
submitted.
I'll just say also, in the language, I'm gonna put it in the chat here. Sorry. They also have language that's kind of is pretty broad and says owner occupancy, full-time resident, whatever the language is using, to the discretion of the to the administration, to the town, in
Right.
general. Yeah.
Yeah, but so here's my thing though. Is a federal tax form, like they would have to bring in like their 1040 and say, here's my tax. I mean, that's kind of all.
1040, yep.
That's very personal information with income and all kinds of stuff that's really,
I mean, you probably wouldn't have to show the whole form, but I do, I mean, I'm gonna jump in here. So, I think that Rhinebeck, and I think that, I know Red Hook is still working on theirs, and Town Hardley, they did owner on premises, and to me, that makes a lot more sense because that solves
Okay.
problems. And I'm not just gonna ask you about it, but, because a lot of people who live up here would prefer not to pay New York City taxes, income taxes.
Right.
I mean, not that they live up here, but they have a house up here, so they're gonna
Right.
add it, so I don't feel like that's gonna help us particularly.
Yeah.
I'm kind of.
saw.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I saw. Yeah, no, this is just one approach that they're taking. That's more on the like verification piece. So it's a
Right.
pretty thorough approach to verification. Owner on premises, yeah, I haven't seen that as much, but I saw it in the survey and I like that approach. That yeah, I think we're open to how different towns want to approach this because the circumstances are different. The
So,
circumstance in Woodstock is not the same as Woodstock.
and before we go forward, so Jude, you said the two towns were Hurley, and what was the other town, Jude, that you said?
Rhinebeck, and I think that
Red Hook,
Red Hook's is still working on theirs. I haven't been following too closely, but I know that there are probably other towns in the state I could find out about. But to me, owner on premises, that's a different category entirely. Those are the people who live here. And
Yeah.
we want, and those are the ones that and you said you think Kingston, I don't know if Kingston has a cap, whatever it is. I know they haven't reached it for their owner occupied. But that's the one that we said is, but we have this problem right now where people are being called owner occupied and they're really not. They're renting out their entire house. So if,
Right.
so that's a different.
Okay. Yeah, I remember this now. Yeah. Owner on premises. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, just because to me, that's a different category and then
It is. It really is. It's
and the
in the
number of those that
intention.
we want to allow is another story. But
Okay.
I think, I could be wrong, Laura, because I'm not on top of every single thing, but I thought that was a distinction that was made in the fee schedule. I think it said owner on premises.
Well, the fee schedule, so the distinction in the fee schedule went off of the current STR, the current Woodstock STR law has 3 categories. And you're correct, the owner occupied was the lowest fee, and the non-owner occupied, and does have a limited number of days a year, but I think that was the highest fee. So yes, the fee schedule was, I think, a 3-tiered based on the 3 categories we have in the current law.
Right. Okay, well, that was.
But there's no distinction between on premises and not on premises in the current law.
The current law talks about owner occupied. Now, and
Gotcha. Okay, but doesn't.
So the one question, Jude, is I mentioned this to Kai earlier, is I do know of one woman who said to me that she lives in her house. That's the only place she lives. But to make money on an STR, she'll stay with a friend and rent it out. So she's in fact not there. She's not occupying the building when she does rent it out, but that's her only house and she just goes and stays with a friend. So is that owner? She's not, by definition, she's not owner on premise, but she's also not a corporation either. And this is how she's getting her money by just leaving for a few days and, living, staying across town.
So I don't think we can write the law for those kinds of exceptions.
Yeah,
I think that has to be worked through in some way, but technically, there's a distinction between renting your property and you're there and not being there.
Right.
And I think that's a line that has to be drawn. And not to say that they can't do it. It's just it is different. And and because it's been such a fuzzy line, I know somebody who calls them their short-term rental owner occupied. They're never there. They went and they got their voter registration changed, and I don't know, maybe they file taxes. I don't know what they're doing, but clearly never ever there. So so there's got to be a better way to do it. And I just think you say you're on the premises, then you probably have to be, or you lose your permit if we find out you're not. So, but
like an affidavit or something.
Yeah. I mean, something that, you know, the
You put it
building
in the
department,
application.
right, and the building department told me that one of the things they do is, or they've been doing recently, I don't know that there's any, and you know, and please, I don't want to quote anybody, but they said, where does your child go to school? And a lot of people don't have children, but you know, that's, you know, if your kid's going to school in New York City, then you're not owner occupied, you know, or somewhere in Florida, for that matter.
Right,
Um,
right.
So, you know, that's my 2 cents. I mean, I really feel like it's a clear line. It's not all wiggly about, you know, how many documents can you produce that may or not really be representative of what's going on. That's my 2 cents.
Sure.
I have other questions for you, which I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe you could look into and get back to us on.
Sure.
Should I go ahead with them, Laura?
Well,
I just,
so I am looking at the Olive. I did click on the link that Kai put in our chat. So I am actually looking at the town of Olive. I could share my screen, but certainly go ahead with your questions. But I don't know if people want to take a peek at what Kai sent us or not.
I just wanted to circle back on I'm pulling it up now, but the Rhinebeck scenario, Jude, were you saying they like generally had a good approach to the on-site piece?
Yes, and I know, and Hurley does too. Hurley, I believe, says owner on premise.
Yep. Right there. Yeah.
And they
Pretty
do make
much.
an exception. For example, if you have a house on one property and next door you own the house next door as well, that's considered owner on premises because you're there.
Right. You're
They
some
did make
supervision or
they
oversight.
made that exception. I don't know that Rhinebeck.
Gotcha.
Okay, so I'll go on with my questions.
Sure.
So I'm not sure exactly which order to go, but you know, I have heard from the building department. Again, you know, I don't want to quote them, so please don't hold me to it. But there are a few people who have permits who don't use them. So,
Oh,
you know, and then I've also heard, you know, the last time we had somebody from the public here who was complaining about permits that were being transferred upon sale, which we also want to end that practice. If you sell
right.
a house, that permit does not go with the property. So, but
Right.
what caught my attention was that the person said there are people who are waiting. They can't get a permit because we've reached the cap. So this is my question. When some of these non-owner occupied permits were given out, they were required to have an SUP. And they went before the planning board. And the planning board granted them an SUP. And then at some point, the planning board said, wait a minute, you know, we're going to put a clause in there that says this terminates if the house is sold. There are a few out there, and I don't know how many, and I'm sorry, Laura, I didn't find out about that. So my understanding is that you can go back and you can change those SUPs. They're not necessarily written in stone, but that's my question to you. What would be involved to go back to those? And again, I don't expect you to answer me right now, but what would it be involved to go back to those SUPs and revise them so that you know there's an end date? And certainly, I mean, you know, we might, I'm going to go on to the next question, but certainly they should not be transferred on sale. So like I said, the planning board realized at some point and started putting that language in there, but I don't know how many there were before they changed it. And it would be good for us to be able to revise those. So then that takes me to another question. So there's, you know, the question about canceling a permit. Say if you don't use it for a year, you don't get to renew it. Somebody else gets a chance. The idea of what can we do? Can we modify an SUP, which I think we can, but I'm just not sure how. And then the other thing is, you know, we had talked about this, and you know, I don't know how everybody feels about it, but I think we have to kind of work through these things and talk about them. But maybe there is a period of time that you get this permit. You get it for 3 years. And then, you know, and then it turns over and maybe somebody else gets a chance. And, you know, and I know there was some, and I'd have to look it up, but there's some town up north that they got taken to court basically, people saying they couldn't utilize their property. And basically the court decision that came down said, well, you can rent your property for 30 days or more. You have that opportunity. You have other opportunities to use your property, not just as a
Right.
short-term rental. So,
Right.
so we, legally, I think we would be okay to say, okay, you get this permit, but it's not for life. Somebody
Right.
gets a chance. And I think what that does is, in my opinion, is it gives the neighbors a break. It's just not like they have to live with this thing
Yeah.
forever. And granted, some of them, you'd never know they have them, but some of them I think are, annoying. So, anyway, so those are that, so those were my questions about, some sort of limitation on the time, which the town can do, I'm sure.
Yep.
Being able to cancel a permit if it's not used, which I also think the town can do, but just, if you have any other input on that. And the main and important one was, modifying an SUP. So those are my.
Modifying an SUP. What was the second one after?
About, well, I'm not sure what order I gave them to anymore. Modifying the SUP, time limitations, putting some sort of limitation.
Yep.
We're talking about the non-owner on premises, which is where I would like to see us go. Not the
Right.
owner occupied. The owner occupied, I don't think, because I'm getting the sense that that's probably not going to have a cap. And my feeling is if they really are owner on premises, then they don't need to be limited because they really are what they are representing to be. And then
Right.
the third one, so it was, I'm sorry, I'm going to say them again because I don't know what I just said. Okay. SUPs can be modified,
Yep.
term limits of like maybe 3 years or whatever number seems fair, and canceling a permit if terminating a
Oh,
permit
right.
if it hasn't been used in
Right.
whatever period of time seems to make sense.
Right. Right.
Those were the
Okay.
okay.
Yeah, yeah, and if I could just clarify, so I got, so to restate, sorry about this. Can we cancel permits if they don't use them in a year? But the ones about revising the SUP, there was a two-parter of that. Because the one is, can you revise the old SUP to no longer allow STR transfer on sale? And the
Right.
other question was, can we modify the permit so that we can put a limit to how many years
Yes.
somebody can have the STR before their STR goes kind of back in the queue and somebody who's on the waiting list can now use their permit. So,
Right.
there was a two-part for the STR
Right.
permits.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
so.
Yep. Yeah. And then and then the time limit thing. Yeah. Yeah. Those are
Okay.
the things I was thinking about, and and I Woodstock is a little different than a lot of the surrounding towns in that, there's much more demand. And so, we're faced with some other challenges that maybe Olive is not. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
So-
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So Jude, you're hoping that Kai can answer those three questions. Are those legal? You're asking for Kai to research and let us know if those are options?
Well, I think that you can modify an SUP, but I'm just not sure what the process is and legally how if they stand up. But I'm quite sure you can. Whether or not it gets challenged is a whole nother story. But if there's
Right.
but there may be not specific to this, but SUPs being modified somewhere down the road for other kinds of uses. And yeah, and I just to try to, like I said, I don't want to put you on the spot and say tell us now, but those were just things I was kind of curious about. And I'm not going to name the person who was here last time, but he brought up, the sort of fairness issue of people who've been waiting to get a permit and they never become available if you just turn it over when you sell it. So then I'm like, well,
Right.
maybe in fairness, this should not be a lifetime permit. Maybe.
No, I don't think that. I think it seems like when the cap was put in place, it was a temporary solution for something more comprehensive. But the idea that there's a cap and then whoever has the permits has them for life
Right, and nobody else can
doesn't
get.
seem right. Yeah. From my just recollection that it was kind of during the pandemic that happened too, right? And then we've kind of been in this space for a long time now, a couple of years. Yeah. I will look. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I think the law was put in place prior to the pandemic, because I seem to remember going
Oh.
to a meeting where I wasn't wearing a mask. But, and the cap at some point was adjusted upward,
Right.
so,
Yep,
yeah,
yeah. So I think I'm gonna go through them all here.
okay,
SUP, yeah, I'm gonna ask our other planners about that one. But
okay,
I imagine there is an approach. I think generally it's different town by town, maybe, or maybe not actually. And the other SUP for retroactive, like sunsetting of the permit. I will also get back to you on that, just because.
yeah, I mean,
Did the planning board do it for every short-term rental permit?
no, what happened, no, this is what I was saying, in the beginning, they
Uh-huh.
granting them in an SUP
They
general.
granting them without, okay.
And then they realized what was happening, and then from then on, they started putting the limitation that it could not be transferred upon sale. And I guess
But it was a special use permit for all short-term rentals,
just the non-owner occupied.
just the non-owner occupied special use permit, okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I will try
Got
to find out, I'll see if I can find out if they have a number of how many of those were. I just
How
don't
many
know.
permits there were, yeah.
How many SUPs, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the sunset period for the permits themselves, yeah, I recall seeing places that had like a 2-year window. And there are places that have like an annual permit or re-permit period too.
Well,
But
people have
yeah,
to re-up here. In Woodstock, people have to re-up. And they
right,
have to
but
pay the
there's
fee
not,
anyway. But I
right,
think if they keep paying the fee, I think they hang on to the permit, but they
right.
definitely have to pay the fee every year.
Right. I remember seeing a couple places where there was kind of a cycle. It was, you have it for 2 years and then you're off the list for the next little while until everyone else has been.
Or
I
you're the
forget.
bottom, you're the bottom of the list.
You're the bottom of the list again. Yeah, this was somewhere in California.
I think the town of Rhinebeck, the village of Rhinebeck, you
village.
get it for a year. And I think that at that point, and I haven't looked at it recently, they only gave a total of 15.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, just generally, I think it is a good approach because it does gear it more towards kind of like the on-site folks that you were referring to earlier, in terms of not purchasing the property just to, it's already owned by someone who's doing an STR, not purchasing it to then use it as a short-term rental full-time as like a business, because you're not going to have the permit forever. So it disincentivizes it in a way.
It does, yes.
Yeah, right. But you're still allowing the use, and to your point, you're also, it's always, I'm curious, where was it? Northern New York, somewhere where that happened, where
I can find it and send it to you.
okay,
but
like it wasn't a financial burden or impact or
Right.
on the restriction on the property, because you could still use it for a long-term rental.
It was,
Right.
yeah, you could use it for 30 days or whatever. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
There were other options. I'll find it for you and I'll send it to you. It was somewhere
The
else.
other thought here too, and these are like in the weeds legal questions. But I think the thing that I remember talking about last year, I guess it was kind of a sunset of the regulation as it exists now, and like a grace period, and then allowing for the new permitting system of 2 years or whatever to come into place. So it's not immediate. And so you kind of grandfather out the
Right.
old system for a couple years. Yeah, I think that generally is a safe approach.
That's a good idea.
And it would give you, it's a long time still, but at least if you said, here's the framework, here's the guidelines, here's the requirements, in 2 years time, when we do this re-registration process with different approach and different requirements.
Right.
But I'll chat with some folks about that one too.
That makes sense because, if there's a new law passed and somebody's had a permit, they don't want to suddenly have it yanked from them. So there should be some sort
Right,
of grace period. And then,
right. There's
transition.
this issue of pre-existing non-conforming use.
Right. Yeah.
So just that's my general thought there. And then yeah, I think part of that could be some pretty clear guidelines on use of permit and like proof of non-use. I know the Granicus software that we provide to the town and the other towns, the town would have to pay a little bit more, but it does have the ability to, if that were in the new regulation, it would monitor how many stays and how many nights were used for that property in a given year or something like that, or not, I guess, in this case. So if it's not being used in 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, whatever, then you have to either start using it again or get the permit taken. Something like that. I'm just thinking more like how you track that, and that's probably the best way to do it. Yeah.
They did say that the Granicus that the county is providing has been very helpful.
Good.
Yeah.
That's so. I have heard back. It's hard. Building departments are so busy sometimes. I reach out, and it looks like everyone's using them, but sometimes I don't get a response from an email from them. So as long as they're using them actively. Yeah, so that's just one thought in terms of like the non-use of a permit. That would also be kind of a deeper dive into how you would want to write that language.
Right.
Just being really clear up front, I think, is the most important part. Which is tough, but yeah, so I think, well, I know, is the intent here to kind of, well, I'm thinking long term here, but it sounds like there's a update of the actual code or regulation at some point.
Well, that's what we're working on, but we
Okay.
we did the survey because we thought that for a handful of us to try to point the direction for the town, it made sense
Yeah.
to have the people of the town tell us what they're thinking before we
Right.
proceed further, because we
Right.
had some various thoughts
Right.
on the committee here, and to kind of be a tiebreaker, we thought, let's ask the people what they think on
Right.
some things. So so that was the thought with the survey.
Okay,
Which
so process the survey, see what the results are, and then try to draft some language based on that feedback.
We do have existing language, and
Oh, okay.
I mean, and on the whole, I do think it's headed in the right direction. A lot of the questions I have been answered as we went along, which I appreciate, but one of them is ultimately for you and the board, or committee, which is, can we give you a copy of that sometime soon to have a pour over and poke holes in?
Well, my thought though is I think that we all ZRC need to take another look, because I think we should see whether this is what we want to send to Kai, or based on, there may be some simplification, because it sounds like owner occupied, I think we're getting a little more clarity. Well, I don't want to speak for the other three of you, but it does seem to me that owner occupied is healthy, that people see a lot of reasons to do owner occupied. It's kind of a win-win-win. Whereas the non-owner occupied is where we're losing our community, right? We want community. We don't want Woodstock to be a commodity, and the non-owner occupied and having a strict cap there. So I do think that that's
well. Let me actually turn just ask a question. Is there of Kai? Is there any sort of peripheral data on you were saying a healthy amount versus your available housing stock of 1%, 1 to 2% for non-owner occupied is generally thought of as within a healthy range. I do just again, when you look at the survey, and this is, I guess, as good a question to bring it up for as any. There there is a lot of winning, as you pointed out, Laura, but I think I also saw a through line of disinterest in seeing unlimited, even owner occupied. And maybe that was just balking at the term unlimited, but I wonder, Kai, if there is any sort of data on if like that's the kind of thing that can get a little runaway too, if you want to have considered that a percentage of that towards housing stock as being healthy.
Yeah, I think, right. I, I don't think we make a distinction on the Housing Smart program about like limits on owner occupied. But I think the difference here, or at least in this circumstance, would be that difference between premises on site and owner occupied. And that if the approach was more on premises, then it would like kind of inherently limit the amount of people who would be interested in using their property like that.
Yeah, again, the idea being that person is on premises during the rental. And I think as of now, the language we've drafted says that particular type of owner occupied, where they are on site for the rental, was the only one we were considering making unlimited. And I think we had made distinctions to the example Laura gave before about say going and staying at a friend's house. And I know you had mentioned that, you know, the owner on premises, you don't see that as often in language wise. But just, you know, that's certainly, I have to imagine, still a concern, you know, in the other, and, you know, work, you know, something to.
Oh yeah, no, I think so. I've been out a little bit out of this world for a bit, but it sounds like Rhinebeck also has that approach.
So I guess that being said, just to be sure, like, I mean, whether or not we want to take another crack at it, and again, we have reviewed the law not so long ago relative to how long we've been working on it. And I just wonder, you know, again, if we can send it your way at some point, and I hope the not too distant future, after we again perhaps, you know, review it with this new lens.
Yeah. Yes, I think generally yes. I think this, because it might go to the planning board, like the county planning board, the change of law, it might be good to have like a gateway meeting, which is
Okay.
yeah, you know about that.
Yeah, I was on plan for a while.
Oh, okay. Oh,
Yeah,
cool.
I guess I don't actually know what a gateway meeting is. What is the
Oh.
gateway meeting?
It's just you know, before, if there's a project that does have to come to the county planning board, we have like pre-meetings to, you know, pre-application meetings, same thing, but I don't know why we call them gateway projects. It's usually if it's more like a more complex project, then you have to bring in a lot of different players for a bigger whatever subdivision or something. So yeah, whenever you feel like you're at a healthy point, we can set one of those up. I don't know if you're.
We can't have a quorum at that meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Let's just. I'm happy to help, and I think whenever you're ready, let's think about an approach to do that. But no, it's good to hear you have some language down on paper to play with. So that's good. And Granicus, I know this was an issue a long time ago. They do have like attorneys that can help you draft it at a cost. I can get back to you on those costs. You guys may know better than I.
Yeah, we have a pretty solid draft. I think you know,
Okay.
we've learned a bit since then, and then there are
Cool.
some basic decisions to make, which is you know, about the expiration, about the SUP,
Yeah.
some things about that we need to learn. But the other thing I just want to point out, that I think Connor was trying to get to too was, and we're saying if you're on the premises, you can have unlimited short-term rentals, but say you have an accessory dwelling unit, then that becomes a long-term, that is never going to be a long-term rental. And so, so it does take some of the housing stock away for.
Right. I think you could do a cap on premises too. I think,
if I could just, the distinction we tried to make in the law at one point was essentially to divide it between some type of shared entryway, or like essentially sharing common facilities, being a room in a house, more in the style of a traditional Airbnb versus say separate entries, separate kitchen facilities, as again, as a way of really micro targeting the that housing stock, which is traditionally been available as at least seasonal long-term rental. And I'm not sure where we landed on by the end of things, but it was, I think, the distinction that everything sort of hung on to address that particular issue.
Yeah, because the way, and it's just to build on what Connor was saying. So we try to have a distinction, even if the owner is there, if they're renting out a space that really could not be a long-term rental, then that was the category that we would be most lenient about. If they're renting out a space that could be a long-term rental, we were going to maybe cap that or be a little stricter with that. So, because if something couldn't be a long-term rental anyway, then, rent out some rooms in your house, almost like a regular bed and breakfast where the owner actually is always there, except this is an Airbnb. They're not, guaranteeing breakfast.
And the only, now I remember the one sort of thing I had about making it, with the shared entryway, was also to sort of, I do think there should, especially, making the distinction for these separate spaces with separate facilities, saying that, we don't want people just building outbuildings in their backyard that don't have a full kitchen and, are just sort of micro slicing the facilities they offer so that it could not be considered. Essentially what I'm saying is, I don't think, and I'm not saying this in terms of like of a never ever situation, but broadly, we don't want people building for more short-term rentals. The point is to work with what is existing and become, in theory, with the market, more, immersed in whatever community you're staying in.
Right. Yeah. City of Kingston, once they pass their new zoning code, it's just no new ADUs can be used as short-term rentals. So that's one approach.
And I think that was where we talked about landing at one point. I like that a lot. I think that's, like, at the least, that's what we should do.
Yeah.
And I think
sorry, I just want to break in because, and every time somebody else on the call says that's a great idea, I speak up because I was a landlord and I got out of it. Because if you get a horrible tenant who trashes your apartment and doesn't pay rent, you can't get out of them, and some landlords go bankrupt. So I 100% understand anybody who says, I will rent my space to a revolving door person, again, owner occupied. I will rent my space to a revolving door person because I know they're not staying. When and this happened during COVID laws happened where, as a landlord, you couldn't evict somebody for not paying the rent. They still owed you the money, quote unquote, but from 30 years of landlord experience, I can tell you, if somebody hasn't got money, you're not getting money. And you as a landlord, you still have to pay the insurance, you still have to pay the taxes, you've got to pay when they trash your building. And I was out getting petition signatures just about a month ago, and I got a signature from a woman who has an ADU on her property, and she had a long-term rental. She used her retirement savings to renovate it to be a rental. She had a long-term renter that lived there for 3 years and didn't pay rent, and she's broke. And she thinks she's got to leave Woodstock now because she's broke. And I am on the side of anybody. If I think anybody ought to be able to have one STR, and if they have an ADU and they want to make it an STR because they don't want a long-term rent, I have lived it. I remember I'm still a landlord. I've been a landlord since, where are we, like 1987? I think I've been a landlord, and I had 2 buildings. I sold the one in Woodstock because it was just too much to keep up. But in any event, and I still have one in Kingston, but it's not easy. And I remember the early days when we had trouble paying the bills. You know, I mean, as a landlord, you got to fix stuff that breaks. You have a water leak, you got to fix it. There's just so much stuff that the landlord is on the hook for, and they just say, it's okay, they can make a long-term rental. It is painful. And I wouldn't stick that on anybody. Just say your first ADU must be a long-term rental, because I have lived it and I understand the issues. And
Well,
so
I wouldn't say it has to be a long-term rental, but it just can't be a short-term rental. You can use it for housing
what
family members or
Sure, but I certainly get it. And in my Woodstock building, I'm on a roll here, pardon me, but anyway,
go for it.
in my Woodstock building, when I owned it and I sold it at the end of 2021, between my late husband and I, we owned it for 30 years. And I had a verbal lease with people. I said, there are 3 rules: pay your rent on time, no illegal activities. And if I understand you're a drug dealer, you're out in an instant. And be respectful to the property, the neighbors, myself. Just be respectful. And I've evicted people for all 3 issues. And with today's laws, you can't evict anybody for any of those issues, except for not paying rent eventually. So, and that's part of why I got out of doing it, was because with COVID, the laws changed and you couldn't get rent. And we had a tenant years ago who was a Rupco tenant, and we had a lease with Rupco, and he went after my late husband with his cane. My husband went to go collect his portion of the rent, and he's swinging his cane at my late husband. And we went to Rupco, and they said, well, he needs a place to live too. I mean, I'm a senior citizen woman. I can't have somebody like that living in my, I need to have some way to move people like that off of my property. So when you just say, oh, it's okay, they ought to have it, we've lived it, and I get it when we shouldn't force everybody to have the first ADU be a long-term rental. That is my extremely strong opinion. I have lived it.
Okay, so I have some
I think we both.
comments about this. So if we make it so that if you buy a property and build an ADU, that ADU cannot be a short-term rental for 3 years, 5 years, whatever. I understand what you're saying completely, Laura, but all I'm saying is what we want to do is disincentivize the idea that you're going to buy a property and short-term rent it.
And I'm with that 100%.
Right.
If somebody hasn't yet purchased the property and they're gonna buy it and they're gonna build an ADU, either when they buy a property, they can't STR it for 3 or 5 years, or if they're gonna build an ADU, they can't STR it for 3 to 5 years. I'm okay with that, because we want people to think twice. I'm okay with that. But a hard and fast rule, this is the rule, but I'm okay with saying, the 3 to 5 years thing. I'm 100% on board with that.
I just don't think it's good. I don't think it's good to incentivize people to build more ADUs. It's a giant hole in the Swiss cheese. There is
ADUs in general, or ADUs as short-term rentals?
As short-term rentals.
Oh, okay.
With and that's sort of the idea here is, like, how do we tackle that? Because while we can argue over where our sympathies should lie in the eternal struggle of housing, the ultimate issue here is that there is still a community fabric. There is still a neighborhood of people that live here. We want to make sure that that is tended to. It is not our responsibility to maximize the profit of any land owning citizen, is to make sure that things are safe and traversable, etc. So I want to see. I again say in general, I think, you know, if we could apply that time frame of 3 to 5 years to existing ADUs, maybe, or something, but I do not see the utility in facilitating the building of more of that particular type of building, which is what we got into the weeds before in a different meeting, the making the distinction between, say, a guest cottage, which we argued over whether or not could be rented out as a long-term rental, something with maybe a kitchenette, but also a standalone bathroom, you know, studio apartment vibe, and an ADU, which is, of course, as I think all agree, as something that is standalone, that can be long-term rented.
Yeah, but see, and my point though, and my thought is the goal of the whole, the STR law began because we want Woodstock to be community, not commodity. And in my opinion, as long as the property owner is there when rooms are rented out, or even there's an ADU and it's rented out, if the property owner is there, we have preserved our community. So in my opinion, to restrict them, you can't have, you know, your ADU can't be an STR. We're preserving the community, because if they are owner, and maybe that's the answer, to say, if you want to build an ADU and you want to STR it, you must be owner occupied. I'm okay with that too, because I agree, we don't want to have all these ADUs built up and the owner's not even there, and it's a revolving door and it's all these strangers in the neighborhood. But if the owner is there when they're renting out for the STR, we're achieving the community that we wanted to preserve, and that's my opinion. And I would be okay with a law that said, hey, if you're going to have an ADU and you're going to rent it as an STR, you have to be owner occupied. You must be there. I'm okay with that as a rule, but I'm not. And so, Kai, you can kind of get a sense here is Connor's on one side of the fence and I'm on the other side of the fence. And I think I feel super strongly about what I believe. Connor feels super strongly, you know.
But I do need to interject to say that there is also we have mandates from the comprehensive plan, and we reviewed them fairly recently. Part of our mandate with this, whether or not, you know, the effect we can whether or not there is a debate on the effect, is to look at its impact on housing, on the housing supply, is specifically mentioned in there. And we all read it, we were all there. And while it's okay to look out for, and we should be looking out for everyone as best as we can, to look out for the landlords, the property owners, we always like to come back and say we don't want to take anything away from anyone, but remember that part of the fabric, part of our community, are these more historically transient tenants who would come in and out of this available housing stock, which is no longer available because, again, we have so many units being rented out. So while I do think we can thread the needle on preserving, you know, dignity for landlords and some revolving door and ability to monetize their investments, it's part of our job, and we reestablished that recently, to look at how at what we're encouraging for the future. And part of it, I believe, and part of the language, I believe, was specifically to promote through the lens of affordable housing, you know.
Yeah, but again, I am okay with things like, when you buy a property, you can't STR it for 3, you know, we pick, is it 3 years, 4 years, 5 years? I'm okay with that. I'm okay when you build an ADU, if it's going to be a new ADU, we can pick a number of years, you can't STR it for some number of years. And I'm also okay with putting in our law that if you have an ADU and you're gonna short-term rent it, you must be present. You can only do that if you're owner occupied. So I'm okay, because we want to achieve this, still have the goal of community. You know, so I'm not going all the way on the side, over on the side of fence where you are, Connor, but I am okay putting some things in that make it harder to have your ADU be a short-term rental, but I don't want to make it impossible. So, in any event, that's so.
Yeah,
These two things.
that sounds like we're
So
getting.
can I ask, I want to ask you a very specific question about this, you know, and what you see other towns moving towards specifically. If you know, we have this intersection of, you know, the revolving door aspect or lottery list, whatever it is that would rotate use. You know, we have in this town something like 4,000 units. Maybe, again, if we're not I'm sure that's if we're not counting guest cottages and all the shady little nooks and crannies that we do know sometimes people get put up in. You know, in terms of understanding that everyone who exists, let's say we pass this thing tomorrow, and everyone who exists right now can be part of this revolving thing, and everyone else has to either, you know, get permitted for non-owner occupancy or on-premise occupancy, you know, not building more. What do you see people doing that, essentially establishing those sort of like, no, you just said, I believe it was what, right? Kingston was no future ADUs.
Yeah. So sorry, you just threw me off with the Kingston part of it. The question is generally, are you seeing people going in that direction?
Yes.
Of disincentivizing it and what the impact is going to be. I think no, I think you guys are more in the weeds than I have seen or experienced with other communities. I think Kingston's a little ahead of the curve in terms of just the new restriction. Like there's enough of a stock of short-term rentals within the existing housing stock, even if they exchange, you know, even if they are bought and sold, it's just the new permitting of ADUs cannot be short-term rental. So there's still this stock of housing, and I don't know if they have a like a sunset on their permit or not. But okay. I think from everything I've been hearing, my general feeling is between the kind of like pause period of 3 to 5 years or whatever that is, Lori, of new, that plus only being able to permit it for a 2-year cycle or something like that, and then having it go back onto a long-term rental. I think between those two things, it's a pretty strong disincentive to build in the sense of like a larger real estate development or a short-term rental company coming in and saying this is a good market for short-term rentals, because there are places that are much less strict than that. And so like, is it a guarantee? No, but the nuance that you guys are giving to this is pointing it in that direction. And I think it also warrants like refining the details, implementing it, taking a pause after 2 or 3 years, seeing how it's going, and then updating it as well too. Like this is kind of a new territory. Like I think it's good to try it and also give yourself, in whatever language you have for the new law, the ability to review and revise every year or something like that too. Because there's no guarantee. This is a little bit of the Wild West. But I think you guys are taking a very nuanced approach to it. And so it sounds like the sides of the fence are really around like the incentivizing of new ADUs. I'd be curious to see how many ADUs are getting built anyway in the town of Woodstock, and it's not many.
Not a ton.
Yeah, so I don't think it's like it unleashing this like flood of investors to build new ADUs or ADU properties, especially
I
with all
will
the other
say,
pieces of the law in place.
as I will say, I really do like the idea of a 2-year revolving door instead of a 3-year revolving door. That seems so much more.
Well, we were talking about that for the not on premises, and then I guess we would have to look at if it was also those people who have the freestanding building like an accessory dwelling unit. I mean, what I was thinking of that that term limit, a chance for other people was for the owner not on premises.
Not on premise. Got it.
But if you're going to talk about owner on premises that has an accessory building,
Yeah,
that's a different. We haven't talked about that yet.
I
And
see. Okay.
yeah, so
Well,
I just
I will just add, I think we had talked about that where I don't remember where we landed particularly. I think though, because what I had wanted to see was again that distinction made where owner on premises shared dwelling, like in the same building with shared facilities, that could be unlimited. But again, making ADUs part of that unlimited seems not tenable to me.
Yeah, and it's totally tenable to me. So you and I are totally on opposite sides of the fence for that. Because if the owner is going to be on premise when you rent, we're preserving our community. And if they want to put an ADU and they want to STR it, I don't personally have an issue with it. And I do understand why some people don't want to LTR, because I've lived the issues. I've spoken to people that have lived the issues, and the laws don't support landlords getting out bad tenants.
I mean, I heard you before, and I elected not to. Again, you can share your anecdotal experience. I can share mine because I also, house people. I also have, stories. Believe me, I think the landlord community has been overrepresented in attendance at these meetings. But I also speak to the people who, again, as I pointed out with my comment about survivorship bias in one of our previous meetings, the planes who didn't make it back because again, the fabric has been disrupted. So again, I think, while I do appreciate that perspective, I don't want to just forget that people were Woodstockers the moment they get, shaken loose.
Well, no, and I agree, but again, I am willing to put some of these caveats. Again, when somebody buys a property, yeah, you can't be STRing it for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever we say. Somebody's going to build an ADU, you can't STR it 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever we say. And if your ADU, if you do have only one ADU and you're going to STR it, the owner must be on premise. I'm okay with that because that preserves our community. So, but there are people that might build an ADU, and I know somebody that has built an ADU because they could STR it, that they would never have done it if they had to make it a long-term rental because it's a long-term rental, I'm not going to repeat all the potential issues, but they're real. They're real. So I do know people that have built an ADU because they could STR it, who never would have done that if they thought they had to only LTR it. So some things you're not necessarily going to get more stock if you make this rule that says if you have one ADU, cannot STR it because it has to be an LTR, or just let family there. That's going,
I mean, again, some people it will, some people it won't. We have to think broadly. And again, my idea doesn't even preclude their participation. It could be a separate body. It doesn't have to be included in the same, let's say, 1% metric that we apply to non-owner occupieds. There could be a separate pool.
Yeah, but I think we're agreeing though, because I'm okay saying if you're going to have one ADU and you're going to short-term rent it, you must be owner occupied. You must always be there when it's rented. I am okay with that.
I think what we're doing there is open. The difference where we're drawing line is, I think that's that is a predicate, that's a necessary, there's one necessary predicate, is them being on site to uh, apply for any type of, again, anything other than, the non-owner occupied pool. But again, if we don't consider this, as part of the fabric of our community as it's historically been, and part of what sustains the more, again, not when I say transient, I feel like that this evokes a different image, but again, this other part of our community that does rent these, that and did and could continue to rent these spaces, and there's no one forcing you, to build these things and capitalize on them. I would say, someone building an ADU to short-term rent in the where, when the law is, again, as uncertain as it is, it's not our job to make that person and those people more profitable. It's about looking at the community. I think we can do both, but it would be, I think, a dereliction of our responsibility to use the comprehensive plan as a lens and not take that very clear mandate,
Yeah. Well,
in this
and
juncture.
I've already stated my position. I as a with 30 years of experience with long-term renters, I 100% understand why some people say, I'm not bringing a long-term renter onto my property. I 100% get it. And then we just leave their unit empty, I guess. I mean, I believe we're trying to solve the community, and we have community. If somebody is going to be owner occupied when they rent it, I believe we preserve community. Anyway, but you've heard me say that already.
I'd like to hear what Jude has to say on this.
I want to throw in a couple of things. So my understanding is that Kingston says if you're building a new accessory dwelling unit, it cannot be short-term rental. If it already exists, that's it falls under a different category. So that's something for us to think about, Laura, is just the new, not the existing. The other thing is that I'm going on memory here. I don't think there are a lot of ADUs that are being used as short-term rentals, at least not legally, that are on the list that I could find. The other thing, just a question, you could short-term rent to somebody and they could decide not to leave too, right?
Well, I think it's a different question there.
Well, I mean,
Housing, I think the law protects people's primary residence. So if somebody's a long-term renter, I believe they get protections that somebody who's just said, hey, I'm just here for the weekend. I don't think they can just stay forever, but Kai, maybe that's a question you have more information on.
Squatters, I'm sure they exist somewhere, and probably you're right, Laura. There's probably less protection under the law, and they probably can be evicted. But I'm sure it's happened. Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, there's also all types of lease agreements you can draw up if you want. I mean, it's not to have verbal contracts with your friends and people really well, and that's the kind of people I allow into my home and my property. But when you're a landlord and you do that commercially, and it's not just friends and family who need a place, then that's what those agreements are for. It's what those carbon copy pink sheets
listen, I'm just going to say, I know other people who rented in Kingston, and during COVID they could not evict anybody. I know that I know this was happening, and hopefully that's but I know that it's gotten very strict in terms of being able to evict tenants. And so I understand where you're coming from that perspective, Laura. The question is, how do we navigate this, that we can all come to some kind of agreement? But Kai doesn't need to listen to us probably about this.
Kai's been very patient over there. I think at some point somebody asked Kai a question and he started to answer, and then we went off to the races here for a bunch of minutes. So Kai, was there more that you wanted to say?
No, I'm just taking in where the pressure point is. I don't have much more to say. I think just one thing I will say is COVID was pretty unique in its in terms of changing or temporarily changing landlord eviction, tenant eviction, landlord relations. I don't think that's going to happen, often. And so the world of being unable to evict your tenants if you really need to. I don't know if COVID is a good example of where things generally lie.
But they got stricter and didn't get less strict.
That's true. That is true. But I
The
think
thing, yeah,
there's
the thing,
still a
the
good
thing that you could,
amount of power on both sides
yeah,
when you
but
do have like a real lead.
the case where you could not evict somebody for not paying rent, that did go away. But the
Right.
ability to evict somebody, the last time I tried to evict somebody, I had to go to a lawyer. I used to be able to just give them, have the papers handled. I could write up the papers myself and have somebody deliver them to my buildings. I couldn't do it myself because I own the building, it's against the law, but I could write up the papers myself and somebody else delivered it. I was doing self evictions in that way. And the law changed enough that the last time I had to do an eviction, I had to pay a lawyer to do it because it became a lot more convoluted. I know, even
Yeah.
though, COVID is not as halted as COVID made it, but it's still painful to evict.
No, definitely. It's the landscape has changed. There are more requirements, but I just don't know if COVID is the standard.
Well, it's
And
not the standard. I
yeah,
agree, but
yeah,
things are definitely stricter, and that's a part of why I get, and I had a low cost building. I had 3-bedroom apartments that were under $1,000 a month. And, yeah, I couldn't afford to continue. I sold it because I really couldn't afford to continue. I had
right,
to do the maintenance myself because otherwise, I made so little in a year on that 6-unit building. And I was doing the maintenance myself,
No, it's a lot. Yeah,
I either had to no longer be I had to either no longer be affordable housing, or I had to sell the building because I couldn't, it was
right.
to do it myself.
Yeah,
I
I
have
think. Yeah, go ahead.
have another question. So, we are post-COVID now, and I'm just wondering if you're seeing any trends that maybe the market for short-term rentals is not as vigorous as it was in terms of people coming to the area and all that kind of stuff. Are you seeing some of that? Because, it seemed like it was going to slow down at some point. Is that something that you guys are tracking and seeing? Because that also might change things a little bit. It may not be as
Goals, I mean, they're still increasing, but they're kind of peaking from this COVID crazy increase. And